Today I'm going to talk about three interrelated things. I got to get my pointer. Ow. Okay. I'm going to talk about something called Comte's rule. I call it Comte's rule. Okay, Auguste Comte, he was a socialist philosopher. Around 1850 or so, he said we should have this socialist country. There should be a flag. On one side of the flag it should say order and progress. On the other side it should say live for others. And we're going to examine the concept of living for others and whether it can be done. Like, can you live 100% for others? Could you live 105% for others? Could you live 5% for others? And we'll determine what's possible. And then in the realm of what I call here sustainable giving, well, how much giving is actually possible, sustainable in a culture. And then I'm going to tie that into how the public sector is related to the private sector. Private sector is a mechanism that creates wealth. Humans, because we have a precarious situation where we can't just food doesn't just fall from trees into our laps. We actually have to produce in order to survive. So we're in this kind of situation where if we want to have a big public sector, like a big government, we're going to have to pay for it, and we pay for it by being productive with our private sector. So it turns out they're linked together. Public sector is not independent of the private sector. It can't kind of exist on its own. There would be no way to fund it, to make it happen. It comes out of the products of labor and stuff. Okay, so let's start with the, I should not say and stuff. Makes me sound kind of, well, anyway, let's start with Comte's rule, live for others. Can we do it? Well, here's a guy who's going to totally live for others. Let's see if you can, I can't get it any closer. Okay, he starts out here with a glass of water. Okay, instead of drinking it, he says, here, take my water. And then you got here a couple kids, a dog, a plant. He could give that water away to any of those life forms, the kids, the dog, or the plant. But the most important thing here with the concept of altruism is that you gave it away. You got to give it away for it to be really of value. And so whether he's watering a plant with his water or giving it to the dog or giving it to the children, he's at least giving away his water. And let's watch him over time as he continues to be very giving. Here he is in week 2 on his hands and knees. He's starting to feel the effects of severe dehydration. The human body loses water. Even if you don't void water, you're going to lose water just coming out of your skin and from your breath. So you could not exist indefinitely without intake of water, because you're always losing it, and you need some of it. So here's week 2. He's on his hands and knees, and he's holding out his water. That means he's going to try this concept of sustainable giving. He's going to sustain his giving and give the water away for the second week. Now let's follow him into the third week. And what we see here is a grave. This is a grave, a tombstone, R.I.P., rest in peace. It turns out if you follow a human body through time, totally giving away all of its water, in about 21 days, the human body will expire. It will not have life force left in it after being totally giving. So I put up here, you can only die for others. You can't really you can totally die for others, but you can't totally live for others. You can't give away all of your value. Now that we know you can't give away all your value and still remain on the earth, let's look into the question let's ask the question, well, how much of your value could you sustainably give and still survive? There are going to be two situations here. One is an individual survival and the survival of a culture or a society. I'm going to look at research from a game theory researcher, Samuel Bowles. In 2009, he published a study in the Journal of Science. in the notes below this video, I'm going to add the complete citation so that you can look up the study if you'd like. And it was a study on the relation of warfare to altruism and natural selection. So what he was trying to find is he was looking at real tribes, the tribe called the Merngen, a tribe called the Tiwi, and a tribe called the Ambra. That's part of his study was to look at really existing people and what are they doing? Are they going to war with each other? In the case of the Ambra, they're peaceful. Okay, in case of the Merngen, they're warlike. Small bands of people, about 26 people, tribe, a 26 person tribe, and he looked at what kinds of sacrifices could be made consistently in those living arrangements, whether you're warlike, whether you have only 26 people, and he modeled some of the real life people into computers and followed them over 100 generations, and just to see their fitness. Was one tribe like dominating the others? Was one certain level of sacrifice really good when you're totally at war? And he came up with what he found was a maximum amount of sacrifice that could be found in a society before the whole society goes extinct. And I'll give you first a visual depiction. What we got here is a fella shooting a gun, two people on this side, let's say they for different tribes or countries or whatever, and the one guy says, the guy in the front says, "Here, let me take that bullet for you." And so what he's going to do is take the bullet so that the other guy can live. That's a sacrifice. It's an instance of giving, in this case giving his whole life. So his fitness would go to 0, but the other guy's fitness would remain a certain level. Okay? In fact, this other guy here might outperform the guy with the gun. If the guy with the gun only had one bullet and no means of producing value, and let's say this guy on the left was really good at farming or something, he could make food. Now he's going to survive, and he will survive off of the sacrifice of the first guy, though. And so the question asked by Bowles was how much of this sacrificing can go on, and how much war is required, or how much does war affect the amount of sacrifice that could go on in a society. Okay, so let's look at some of the limits that Bowles was finding. Bowles was using some assumptions, okay, and you can again you can look at the full citation that I'm going to type in below the video. And what he found was, when looking at groups of people like the Merngen, which were warlike small bands of people, I think not more than 26. Okay, what he found was that you could get up to a level of about 13.3% total giving or sacrificing in that warlike band of people, and that would sustain the people. They could handle that. In fact, so basically, it's out of like 1,000 individuals, if 133 of them went to the front of the battle, and picture something like from The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, some big battle, and 133 of 1,000 sacrificed themselves on the battlefield, well, the rest of them would live really well, because the other guys they wouldn't be taking the bullet, be taking the arrow or taking the sword or what have you. Yeah, I guess the boomerang, because I think these were near Australia or New Zealand or somewhere around there, these tribes. So 13.3% giving was possible. Continued giving at that rate was possible in a small band of people of 26 who are constantly at war with other bands of people and get to take the bounty of the war with them when they defeat the other people. So the Tiwi were a larger group of people, and Bowles, I think, used them as a model. They're still warlike, but there's more than 26 of them. It could be 26,000. I mean, he might have modeled populations as high as 26,000 or 26 million, whatever. He modeled it for like over 100 generations, and just kind of watched what happened. In the case of the Tiwi, a tribe like that, very large, still warlike, could support 7% giving, I'll call it total giving, 7% sacrifice, or you could say altruism. And the Tiwi tribe could support that and stay alive, basically ward up, not go extinct. At higher levels of sacrifice, again with the Merngen at higher levels than 13.3, the whole tribe suffers and eventually goes extinct. And it may take a lot of generations, but eventually they will all die because that's too much sacrifice, even for a small group of warriors. Okay, and the Anbra were the peaceful people, and a large society and peaceful, and they could give about 2.9%. So they could, it's hard to see it, but they could sacrifice 2.9%. If 100 men were on the battlefield and 29 of them said, hey, let me take those bow and arrows for the rest of you, I'll sacrifice my life, the tribe will still live on. And 29 out of 100 could do that. Or wait, 29. I'm sorry, 29 out of 1,000. I forget that when you have a percent, it moves the decimal point over. So 29 out of 1,000 can sacrifice themselves, and the Anbra will go on and exist. Now let's look at how this ties into funding a public sector. And this one I need to move the video here. How do you fund a public sector off of the products of a private sector, the produced wealth in a society from private sector in a market or markets? Okay, so there's always many markets. Here, let me just pull this off. Alright, let's look at this country. This is the United States. And in 1787 in the United States, we had a public sector about 1% as large as the private sector. The private sector was maybe 100 times larger than the public sector, and I'm trying to depict that with a rough cartoon of a horse as the private sector pulling a sled or sleigh, and that's the public sector. Remember I said if you want to fund a government, you have to make some wealth because we're in a precarious position. Our lives, we don't have food dropping into our lap, so we have to produce goods to survive in the first place, and then we have to produce even more goods to do this government thing. Okay, now I'm not an anarchist, but I'm just letting you know there's a relationship between private and public sector. The public sector is not something independent of the private sector, and it might have to be tied to a certain percentage of the private sector in order for humans to continually exist, or any society to continually exist. Okay, so we start with 1787. We had what? A U.S. Constitution was signed. Some laws were written. Some rules were written up about federal governments and separation of powers. Okay, and the federal or the government spending was something like it might have been 0%, half of a percent, but it wasn't more than like 1% of the private sector. All the wealth produced in America at that time. In 1934, if you look at, and we're going to stick with just federal spending and revenue only. I'm going to treat them the same here, but we'll have to differentiate spending from revenue when we get to 2012 because they aren't the same anymore. They're a lot. There's a great difference between how much we take in and how much we spend. So in 1934, the government took in 5% revenue when compared to the GDP or the produced wealth in the country. So in this case, we got the horse now pulling something that's 5% of its physical capacity. Okay, if you want to think about this, there's as an analogy, a horse will have a physical capacity to pull weight. And if you have a government that's 5% weight of the, or 5% of the capacity of the horse can go up this hill. You can see that you're climbing up a hill. This little slant here signifies that precarious position humans are in, that you got to take some risks, you got to exert some effort. In order to continue staying alive, you're going to have to do something good with a reward at the end, or else you die. Okay? So we got a slant here, hill, and we're going to pull this government up, and government can do some good things for us, like protect us from enemies, give us a civil means of resolving disputes, protect us from each other. Some of us, maybe as much as 1% of us, might become criminals at some point, and then we'd use the police to deal with that, the justice system to deal with that minority of us who will become criminals. Okay, so we'll need some of that wealth produced by the climbing of the horse, and in this case the government is taking up 5% of the horse's capacity. Now today we've got a different situation, nothing like 1934. It is a case where now the government is taking up 30% of the horse's physical capacity. How did I get this? I looked at the GDP, which is for 2012, my estimate was 15.88 trillion. And of that, the federal spending was 3.63 trillion. And the difference, this would be what the private sector is producing toward the GDP was 12.25 trillion. So the private sector is making that much wealth. The public sector is spending that much wealth, and that much wealth is 30% of that. So the government is now using 30% of the dollars, or the wealth, or the food, or the oil, or whatever we're producing with the private sector, the public sector is consuming. Okay? So it's six times, the government is 6 times larger in relation to the wealth producing capacity of our nation than it was in 1934. So we have 6 times the relative government. We've got, maybe 1,000 times more government, but our economy has grown, or the markets, I want to keep that as plural as I can. The markets have grown, and we've produced a whole lot of wealth. So the government might be 1,000 times bigger, or something like that, but it's about 6 times bigger in relation to our wealth producing capacity. So we're just putting that little bit of a drag on the markets, a little bit more, 6 times more drag, let's say that, than in 1934. Now, how does this relate to the study with the sustainable giving? Like how much giving can you get away with before you die? Well, let's look at taxes. In order to get the government to spend this and to not go underwater, we have to have the government tax us so that they can spend the money. So the revenue taken in, and tax revenue, can be likened to being a form of altruism. Not complete altruism. If the government was doing absolutely nothing to help you and you paid taxes, that's complete altruism. If your government was taking half of the money that you were spending in taxes and somehow benefiting your life, that's maybe 50% altruism for every tax dollar. And that is the number that I used, 50%, as an estimate of how much money that we give the government that we get back in value, in some kind of value. That might be, that's a subject for study. Game theory researchers, political scientists, a lot of people, historians, people can study how much tax dollars, what proportion of each tax dollar is returned to the citizens, or the ones paying it, or anything like that, and they can determine how much altruism is in a dollar of federal revenue. Okay, I'm assuming that 50 cents of altruism is in every dollar of revenue. That's, like I said, that number can even change. Under that assumption, and the assumption that we're peaceful, like the Ambra are, the Ambra could withstand could carry 2.9% altruism in their society, and if half of all taxes are altruistic, then the tax rate can be up to twice as high as 2.9%, and you'll still be sustainable. So that 1934 number is kind of neat. That 5% number is a little bit less than the 5.8% that's possible in a peaceful society for a tax rate on an evenly a flat tax rate, either a flat or a fair tax. There's something that's sustainable in peaceful society. Over time, over 100 generations, you'll still be around. The cops will still be walking the beat. The courts will still be functioning. The citizens will still be doing what they want. They won't be starved like when they tried a whole lot of taxation and spending in Red China, or a whole lot of taxation and spending in Soviet Russia. You won't get those kinds of outcomes by following the research here, what the research indicates. And that indicates that a good amount for a flat tax in this country would be the one we had in 1934. We could even go a little bit higher, but I'd like to see I'd like to see justification for going higher than 5%. How much good are we getting for a tax dollar? I know how much sacrifice you can get away with before your society goes extinct, and I just need to know how close do you want to get to that number before we say, okay, let's not have a government bigger than that. In the long run, it is detrimental. Okay, thank you.